In a big win for India, the nation leaped past the United Kingdom in the final 3 months of 2021 to become the fifth largest economy in the world, according to figures from the International Monetary Fund. The calculation is based on US dollars, with India extending its lead in the first quarter. According to this report, the size of the Indian economy with regards to nominal cash was $854.7 billion, in contrast with the UK, which was at $814 billion. The latest report reflects the economic trajectory these two countries have taken in recent months. Well, while UK is witnessing its worst cost of living crisis, soaring inflation and a potential recession, the Indian economy is forecasted to grow more than 7% this year. With new numbers backing India's growth, is India now becoming the economy to beat? Is India emerging as a true competition to other world economies? We'll talk about this with our guest. Joining me on the show at this point in time is Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, former diplomat, Pathikrit Payne, strategic and international affairs expert, Ashish Killa, economist, also joins us on the show, Gautam Mukherjee, senior journalist, joining us on the platform as well, and last but by no means the least, Professor Madhav Nalapat, editorial director of the Sunday Guardian, also here with us. Professor Nalapat, I'd like to start with you, sir, if you can hear me.
Please go ahead.
Well, sir, this was the writing on the wall. This was slated to happen. But it's happened at a time when the United Kingdom is running from pillar to post to salvage its economy. And while the world finds itself, in bit of a cash-strapped situation because of COVID-19 and whatnot, India is rising from the ashes.
Well, I'd like to say that geopolitically, Prime Minister Narendra Modi made the right choice, in which he pointed out that you can't exclude half the European continent and half the Asian continent's resources, namely the resources of the Russian Federation, and then expect your economy to thrive. Much of the problems that Western economies are facing have been self-inflicted by the manner in which they have been trying to prolong this war in Ukraine to the benefit of the People's Republic of China. In contrast, India has followed a pragmatic policy. Prime Minister Modi has set up a world record in vaccination, a historical world record. I don't think any country in the world, including China, has done more vaccinations than India. At the same time, he has not gone the other extreme of China and some other countries in going in for vigorous vaccine mandates and then going in for lockdown after lockdown, as you're seeing, for example, in China. So he has avoided a lockdown in 2021. He has avoided vaccine mandates till now. He has followed a very sensible, sober policy. And that is now showing results. So I think I'm sure with this crackdown on corruption, in the past, especially in previous dispensations, corrupt officials used to be used by foreign and Indian companies to destroy competition, local competition. All kinds of cases would be filed against them under the multitude of colonial laws that we still have. The PM is trying to reduce that. He has reduced about 36% of that, but some more remains to be reduced. He is working very hard at that. But that is why we are a work in progress, yes. But we are a work in progress in the right direction. And if I may point out, where you go to purchasing power parity, our rank is now number 3 in my calculation. It's not number 5. And that is a sign of the fact that India, under Prime Minister Modi, is emerging as the third superpower, and that within a decade, it will be acknowledged as the third superpower on the globe.
Absolutely. Ambassador Mukherjee, what are your thoughts on this great accomplishment? Yesterday, we were talking about the induction of the INS Vikrant, and today we are talking about an accomplishment which was, slated to happen for a long time. There was a bump in the road because of COVID-19. And what Professor Nalapat also said that, the ascent of India coming to this level has not been an easy one. Some difficult decisions were taken, but we finally made it, and we did that because we stayed on course.
Absolutely, Vineet. What a striking blow to this Western narrative about India and all the things that are wrong with India, when it's actually time for the West to take a very hard look at what's wrong with them. This is a time for them to introspect. And what greater coincidence than for a country colonized for 180 years, left in a miserable condition in 1947, partitioned and bleeding by the British imperialists who drained us of everything, and for us now to overtake them at a time when British racism will ensure that a person of Indian origin, highly competent, is not going to become their prime minister because it's not yet possible for the Brits to accept it. Our leaping past them in this manner also demonstrates that the Indian economy under Prime Minister Modi has come of age. Our Ukraine policy was judicious. Our spot purchases was spot on. Our decision not to sell wheat when we thought food security is important was right. Our decision to do for Indians what is good for Indians, like the Americans and the West do what's good for them, was the right policy. And on top of that, we have done it quietly. We haven't boasted. We haven't tried to bully our neighbors. We have done it the Indian way. And today, I am so proud, Vineet, of being an Indian and sharing this success with all of you and my co-panelists on the panel. Vineet.
Absolutely. So are we proud, ma'am. Pathakrit Pain, this has been a tough road for India. And, the tide has also been against India in terms of this elevation. What more do you think is required at this point in time, for India to keep this pace and, perhaps get to the #1 position?
Vineet, we are on course of it. If you look at the Goldman Sachs report of 2007, it had already predicted that by 2045, we are going to be the third largest economy of the world. And secondly, if you look at what has been achieved, #1, these are these accomplishments. In fact, in 2022 April World Economic Outlook report of IMF, they had already given that figures of $3.5 trillion in terms of nominal GDP and $11.7 trillion in terms of purchasing power parity. That was India's estimate. So what we have achieved is in spite of three major problems. #1, there's a supply chain constraint that we had, and we have been working on it. Modi government have done incredibly well in terms of making sure that the supply chain constraints in the future are taken care of. #2, the oil price shocks because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. And #3, in spite of the Federal Reserve raising its interest rate in an unprecedented manner, the highest in the last 22 years. So in spite of those, if you look at the figures, these figures just didn't come out of the blue. In 2021 financial year, 2021-22, India's gross total export was $670 billion, including around $250 billion of services export. Gross tax collection was 27 lakh crore. It had an FDI of $83 billion. Its remittance was $80 billion gross. And the government had worked incredibly in terms of installing and implementing structural reforms. #1, GST is one of the biggest of that. Now, as also Professor Nalapat also mentioned, the steps that have been taken in terms of doing away with the corruptions, the white-collar crimes, which have incredible negative impact on productivity, that is being taken care of. In addition to that, allowing 100% contract manufacturing in FDI, reducing the corporate tax level to standards at par with Singapore-like countries at 25%, and then also if you look at the production-linked incentives that are being given for 13 to 14 sectors, so that the entire supply chain ecosystem is created within the country, and we no more remain just a country where products are assembled. So these are very critical steps that have been taken by Government of India in terms of making sure that there is ease of doing business. There are major sectors which have been opened up and which are actually giving major impetus to new industries. For example, look at the defense industry. It was always, the lobbies made sure for a long time that we only import. Today, if you look at the defense industrial ecosystem, the military industrial complex that we are creating, in terms of Atmanirbhar Bharat, this is going to create a next generation of jobs. There are a large number of startups which are involved in actually, creating products for the Government of India, for DRDO, for the armed forces. The space sector has opened up. There is major impetus being given by Government of India in semiconductor research. In future, you would see a lot more being done in terms of quantum computing research, artificial intelligence, blockchain, 6G. So a lot has been done in terms of giving impetus to those things. But two more things I want to say, Vineet. Number one, while the government of India is very, very resilient, in spite of all the challenges, it has still maintained a $550 billion foreign exchange reserve, $550 billion plus. But the condition of many of the states, which the Prime Minister also mentioned in terms of the revenue culture, the non-merit freebie culture, the condition of many of the states is not good. So those states, because of the populistic profligacies and giving freebies, their condition is bad. There has to be stringent reform, and there has to be a carrot and stick policy. Otherwise, some of the states, RBI report mentions, are in very bad condition. And number two, it's very important that the other reforms which have been resisted by vested interest in this country, for example, agricultural reform, the government gives push to those. Remember, we have achieved this in spite of lobbies within the country and outside the country trying their best to make sure that India doesn't become a resilient economy and merely remain a market. This is where Prime Minister Modi's achievement is, that in spite of all the geopolitical challenges, economic challenges, lobbies, NGOs trying to create all kinds of problems, the government of India made sure that we actually did with the reforms, went ahead with the reforms. And when GST was implemented, when demonetization happened, a lot of questions were raised. The results are here today. Unprecedented $670 billion of exports. The next year's target is something around $800 billion, $500 billion of merchandise export, around $300 billion of services export. So things are being done. And this is what is important, Vinit, my last point. Structural reforms take time to actually show results. The effort and the work that has been done by the Modi government from 2014 are now showing results in unprecedented GDP growth rate, which we saw this time is 13.6 rather, and we would see these growth rates. So it will take time, but I'm very sure our next target is to make sure by 2024 we become a $4 trillion economy, and we should be at par to become a $5 trillion economy by 2026-27, and of course a $10 trillion economy by 2032. We also have to make sure that we give more impetus to renewable energy and spread our basket for oil import or energy import, so that our dependence on some of the countries which are at times try to create dictators comes down. So we are on the right track. We have to be very careful on one last point. One other thing is that internal security. A lot of efforts are being made by vested interests to create problems, and we have to make sure that the internal security issue is also taken care of. The government has done well in terms of making sure terrorism has not happened to that extent since 2014, as it used to happen in the past. But you know, the elements who are trying to create demographic change, radicalization, or the cross-border smuggling, fake currency rackets, these also have to be, and they are being done. Capacity building is happening, but probably we have to give a little more impetus to that. The states have to be equal contributor. Unfortunately, some of the states are actually lagging behind and drawing India back. Otherwise, the growth rate perhaps would have been much higher, Vineet. And we achieved all these in spite of all the challenges.
All right. Okay. Well, Gautam, if you look at some of the graphics that we've been flashing on the screen, India is at number 5, and that is something to be very proud of. But at the same time, the difference between India and Germany in terms of the sheer numbers, there's a huge gulf in that. Considering the points that Pathakrit has also made, if these are worked around, maybe perhaps even for the next 5 to 10 years, then that gap can be closed in further, and India's position at this particular slot can be endured for longer.
Well, Vineet, to take nothing away from the grand tour that Parikrit has just taken us on, every point is valid and very nice to listen to. I want to say that we've come from 10 to 5 in under a decade, and from 5 to 4 and then on to 3 is not going to prove that difficult. One of the main features of 10 to 5 is domestic growth and domestic consumption. What has changed now for the first time? Earlier, you hardly had much more than a 10% contribution from exports, and mainly commodity exports, to the Indian overall GDP basket. Today, this is changing. It started with the services under domestic, the the 10 to 5 movement. And now it is significant that we are heading towards $100 billion in exports. It's something that we have never, ever visualized before, perhaps, at least most of us. And now this is becoming part and parcel of our growth trajectory. I don't think there's a vast gap between us and Germany, particularly when you compare a country that is growing at over 7% or 7% even, and one that is barely keeping its head above water at 1% or less. This is the trouble with Japan and Germany. They may be bigger economies than India today, but they're not growing, and we are. The last point I want to make is, like China under Deng, which had the humility to just keep growing and not be a threat to anybody, and in fact be a major contributor to the global food chain, the global, not the food chain, but the global supply chain, without any difficulties. They also, because of their close relationship with the West, helped to bring down the USSR and liberate so many countries into freedom and better choices for themselves, which they could make. For us, it is going to be a fairly easy thing to overtake both Germany and Japan as things stand, simply because we have pent-up demand and we have better exports, and they have very little going on. Now, as far as Ukraine goes, the reason why it had the kind of impact it did is they were all America, Europe, most of the developed world, Australia, same thing is happening to Australia down below, is that they have borrowed to the gills, their growth rate is dismal, and then they have taken on a war which is sapping their economy, both in terms of inflation and in terms of every other form of devaluation that you can imagine. So we are on a good wicket, Vineet.
Right, we are on a good wicket. In fact, we have to enhance and basically elongate that partnership with our GDP numbers as well. Ashish Killa, if you're there with us. Ashish?
Yes. Yes.
Well, Ashish, shed some light on the nature of the economy and how it is basically fighting through all the turmoil of COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, and other geopolitical factors to stay on course. What is India doing right and has done right, to keep up the momentum? Because momentum is everything.
So, first of all, thanks for the opportunity. I think basic reforms, as a learned panelist also mentioned, for example, the UPI implementation in the country is world class. Nowhere in the world the way UPI has been adopted in our country and has just facilitated a digital payment interface across all merchants, all people. It has just leapfrogged us 10 years. The opening of Jan Dhan accounts, reaching to the micro level of the population in the country, the Aadhaar integrations, the GST reform, the RERA reform for the real estate sector. Always we used to have a big problem in terms of crude shock. Whenever there was a crude shock, our Indian economy used to suffer a big time, and government has been prescient in terms of reducing the dependence on crude oil by increasingly focusing on ethanol, by increasingly focusing on electrification, by increasingly focusing on other forms of green energy. So if you see, step by step, they are addressing first the micro root challenges to bring the nascent economy, the grassroots population to participate in the growth, at the same time making us immune to the global shocks. Today, when we took the example of UK and how we raced ahead of them, you won't believe UK depends on 50% of its imports on food and gas on outside and hardly has any storage facilities. So today it has become so vulnerable to the cost of shock of the cost of gas price rise and the food. And similarly taking steps on the geopolitical front like Brexit and all, further reduce their ability to trade. India, on the other hand, has been far more welcoming in terms of opening up on the geopolitical front, in terms of its trade relations with Russia, in terms of doing whatever is required. S. Jaishankar, our external minister, was on court that when he went to US, his son showed a paper printed vaccination certificate versus what we have in terms of digital linking to every facet of our life. So that is where the Indian economy is now leapfrogging on tech stack. The unicorns now are coming from India. The startup culture is mushrooming, and we are having the demographic dividend. Nowhere in the world is such a young population available. As per the McKinsey report, this is not the decade of India, it's a century of India. 20% of the global workforce population will be in India in the next 20, 30 years. And imagine the wealth, $3 trillion rupees of wealth was created in India in the last 70, 75 years. In the next 8 years, all that 70 years of wealth will be recreated again. So this demographic dividend coupled with the government's focus on infrastructure, mobilizing the root population will give us the opportunity and impetus to take it to the next level.
Absolutely. Professor Nalapat, concluding thoughts from you. This has not been a fluke. This has been a strategic advancement, which has been facilitated by a knack for reforms. This should continue, and the pace at which it has continued should also perhaps be doubled at this point in time. Do you concur, sir?
I do. Let me say that when Chief Minister Modi visited China, I was also in that country at that point in time, coincidentally, and I wrote a piece in the Sunday Guardian that here is the Deng Xiaoping of India, the future Deng Xiaoping, as has correctly been said by one of our panelists. The reality is, as McKinsey has correctly said, this could be, forget the Asia century where India and China are going to Hindi, Chini, bye-bye. It's never going to happen. It's a dream. We should instead aim for the Indian century, the India century. And here, for example, those states that are really doing a horrible job, people are voting with their feet and running away from those states. Look at Nitish Kumar's Bihar. Millions of people are leaving Bihar because there's no work in Bihar, no worthwhile work there, thanks to the quality of governance provided by Mr. Nitish Kumar, who now hopes to be Prime Minister of India. So that is the point. And I'd like to say that states should compete with each other. Maharashtra, Rajasthan is now doing better. Andhra, Telangana are competing with each other. Tamil Nadu, Karnataka competing with each other. Even Kerala, of course, has got a huge amount of remittances. It's in a different kind of situation. But states should compete with each other, not in disastrous economic policies, but in ensuring that the people in these states continue to live in these states and more people come to these states. Every train you have people coming to Kerala from Bihar, every train. And that shows the quality of governance in Bihar as compared to Kerala. So I'd like to say that there are so many good steps. The agricultural law, for example. What happened? There was a problem with some states, and therefore the Prime Minister's statesman-like gesture, he froze the law. But the reality is it is a good law. And it's important, therefore, to make a state-oriented kind of situation where this kind of reform is concerned. Let each state decide how much reform it is ready to have. And then we'll soon see in under 5 years which are the good states, which are the good reforms. And that is what is happening in India, or what should happen even more in India. As Prime Minister Modi says, we have to ensure that our federal structure is respected and that freedom is there with the state governments. So let the states compete in prosperity, not let them compete in ruinous economic policies.
All right. Ambassador Mukherjee, concluding thoughts, ma'am?
I fully concur, and I do believe that under our Prime Minister, we will follow a policy of steady economic growth along with controlling the deficit and with fiscal austerity. And I completely agree with my co-panelists to say that those states who are using freebies to stay in power at the greater risk of our economy slowing down, we have to find a way to control this kind of ruinous economic policies, and to say that ultimately people will insist on good governance because they can see the contrast between states that function and states that don't. And that is, in a democracy, is the best way to keep the economy going forward. And moreover, when we have a Prime Minister like Prime Minister Modi and the kind of economists we have in our country, the corporate sector, those who are absolutely convinced that to move India forward, we have to work day and night to keep the machine running. That's the way forward, Vineet, and I'm very confident we will overcome all these crises. And yes, it will be that this century will belong to India, not to India and China, but to India. The
Abs-
Chinese economy is slowing down big time, and the Chinese should think about that.
Absolutely, ma'am. Absolutely. Well said, ma'am. Patikrit.
Very quickly, Vineet, I don't want to call it a sweet revenge, but we must not forget that the British Empire looted $45 trillion from India. And from that area, from that point, we actually recovered to become the 5th largest economy, and we will overcome others also very soon. It is true that it's a work in progress. There is no time to actually take rest and celebrate the laurels. It's a long way we have to go. Number 3, I think we need to encourage entrepreneurs even more. We have 70,000 registered startups. 50% of Indians are self-employed. It has to be, the societal culture has to change in the schools, in society. The parents have to encourage. You cannot become a $20 trillion economy unless you have thousands and thousands of new organizations created by budding entrepreneurs and which are backed by creative minds, which starts from school itself. So that cultural change has to happen. Number 3, there are certain states where there is a literal parallel economy run on black money and illegal activities. We have seen in some of the states where the amount of money that is being unearthed, which are all black money, and because of through illegal activities of coal smuggling, cattle smuggling. So it is not necessary that all the time the states will do reforms, because a lot of people get employed with illegal activities. Sometimes it has to be imposed, and that's why I believe while federal structure is fine, sometimes the carrot and stick policy is very, very important, because some of the states have been very irresponsible and they take the excuse of federal structure, but they have been extremely irresponsible, both in terms of internal security and both in terms of economic performance. So while it is a great thing that what we have achieved, we have to be very careful. Vested interests will try to create internal security problems. They will try to create political problems. They will try to create political instability. And let's not forget what the West always does in terms of creating ripples within this country, in terms of colored revolution. We have to be very careful on that.
All right, Gautam, 30 seconds. Quickly, please. Concluding thoughts.
Well, Vineet, I believe that we need to plow on and not really dwell on what the opposition is doing, because the opposition is desperate. They do not see any probability of seizing power at the center. They will create trouble. People from outside who are helping them will help them. And there is nothing that we can do without distracting ourselves from the main task, which is to plow on. And when we do that, they automatically fall by the wayside. There are risks. And if they get totally out of hand, we will have to use non-democratic remedies, such as the army, such as president's rule. And this is something we have done before, and something, if forced to